Here's what a viewer from a recent video commented. I've never been a great fan of speaking in terms of borrowed chords. Seems to me we can best describe tonal function in terms of parsimonious voice leading along a gradient from more dissonant to more consonant. I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts on the utility of analysis in terms of borrowed chords. I was delighted to hear that perspective because I've had a similar thought for a long time. In this video, we're going to critically analyze the concept of borrowed chords. We'll start by explaining how it's typically taught in university, then I'll give my critique of it, and finally I'll provide a counterbalancing perspective to show why this concept is both helpful and unhelpful depending on the way we look at it. Investigating this will be insightful beyond the narrow topic of borrowed chords. It'll help us consider what makes a good music theory explanation. I'm Jay Beard and I make videos about Scriabin and music theory. Check out my website to see the courses and lessons that I offer, and please like, comment, and subscribe. Now let's get to it at the whiteboard. Here's the typical explanation of borrowed chords you'd hear in a Theory 3 class in university. The triads within the major and minor scales have certain qualities. In a major key, the 1 chord is always major, 2 is minor, 3 is minor, 4 is major, and so on. In minor keys it's different, with 1 being minor, 2 being diminished, 3 being major, and 4 being minor. So in the key of C major, we'd expect the 4 chord F to be major, but what if instead we had an F minor chord in the key of C major? We could say that it's borrowed from C minor because in C minor, F minor naturally forms the triad on the 4th scale degree. It can go the other way too, like being in C minor and getting an F major chord borrowed from C major. This would be called borrowing from the parallel major, parallel meaning C is the same root in either case, whether in major or minor. But why stop there? We could look at the scale degree chords we get from all the modes starting on C. The viewer's comment was in response to me saying we could think of an F-sharp half-diminished 7 as a borrowed chord from the Lydian mode. People sometimes call that modal mixture and sometimes go a step further, saying a mystic chord is just a borrowed chord from Lydian dominant, or a minor major 7 chord is borrowed from harmonic minor. By this point we've drifted pretty far from the major-minor borrowing idea traditionally taught in university theory. So what's going on here? Why are people interpreting everything through the lens of borrowing from a few scales? The idea of borrowed chords is internally coherent and works, but is it really a good explanation? My main critique is that pointing out correspondence between things isn't really an explanation. We ask the question, why did the composer use a minor 4 chord in a major key? And the theory professor responds, because it's borrowed from the parallel minor scale. After all, we didn't use any old minor chords starting from anywhere. We used the one that corresponds with the minor scale of the same root pitch, therefore the chord change is justified. All they've really done is point out how borrowed chords correspond to another scale without really explaining why borrowing from the scale would make the chord change sound good or why composers are borrowing chords in the first place. There are so many assumptions we could deconstruct here, like what about all the other scales those triads fall into? Why would we never label something borrowed from the octatonic scale, for example? The answer is that life in music involves culturally meaningful descriptions of things, as well as more objective, cold mathematical descriptions of things. The borrowed chords idea is more of a cultural explanation relating to the tonal system and the prevalence of major and minor scales, while myself and the commenter like to also have the objective mathematical explanation, which in this case pertains to parsimonious voice leading. I'll explain the voice leading perspective soon, but first here's a non-musical example to illustrate the difference between cultural explanations and objective explanations. Why do so many people give each other gifts towards the end of the year? The cultural explanation is that there are holidays like Christmas and Hanukkah at the end of the year that involve gift giving. Yet this begs the question, why do these traditions exist in the first place? For that, we'd need to turn to objective facts about the relationship of the Earth to the Sun, creating cold temperatures and short days. Each explanation is helpful in a different context. If someone asks why Christians give gifts at the end of the year, it's not really an explanation to point out that it's similar to how Jews give gifts on Hanukkah. This resembles the borrowed chord explanation. While if someone asks why you put gifts under a Christmas tree, it's not really helpful to point out that the days are objectively shorter. In that case, explaining the cultural tradition of Christmas would be the best explanation, yet the objective explanation still adds further depth. The more objective mathematical explanation for the use of F minor to C major comes from the idea that a small amount of movement sounds smooth. We can objectively point out that only 2 pitches had to shift a semitone for the chord change. If you compare this to all the other ways major and minor chords can move between each other, like I did in this video, you see that a shift of 2 semitones is quite small relatively speaking, thus it's not surprising that composers would utilize this parsimonious voice leading. The great thing about this theory is that it extends to all types of harmony, while the borrowed chords theory arbitrarily revolves around a few scales. The real underlying explanation is parsimonious voice leading, and it's largely a coincidence that chords tend to have parsimonious voice leading between parallel major and minor scales. An exception is if you try borrowing the 7/2 diminished 7 chord from major when you're in minor. It doesn't sound smooth or good at all because the voice leading is wonky with such a high displacement. This shows that chord changes don't necessarily sound good merely because they're borrowed from a parallel mode, it's the voice leading that matters. A strange thing to point out is that out of the 7 modes of the major scale, probably about 90% of all music is made with just the 2 modes we call major and minor. I hate saying this, but it would seem as though the prevalence of those particular 2 modes is just a cultural fluke. I'd be very impressed if someone could prove otherwise. We can imagine a world where most music is made using the Lydian mode or the Dorian mode. There's nothing very structurally different. The use of major and minor scales is a cultural fluke that keeps reinforcing itself because that's what people are used to hearing. Similarly, the idea of borrowed chords can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If Scriabin and Mozart learn about it in music school, which they probably did, they're more likely to emulate it and keep perpetuating it. So even though parsimonious voice leading is what's behind it all, we can still acknowledge the cultural practice of toggling between the culture's 2 favorite modes. We can reject the modal mixture idea that incorporates other modes and scales because it doesn't use those culturally prominent modes. Instead, we can use pitch kit to give a proper name to chords and scales. The reason I show memes of autistic TV show characters for the objective theory perspective is because neurodivergents are the sort of people who especially look past tradition in favor of mathematical explanations. It's no secret that me and a lot of my viewers are neurodivergent. My channel is all about giving a more objective mathematical perspective on music theory, while still acknowledging the cultural tonal perspective. Finally, I'll end by showing a quote from Vornska, the theory professor I've collaborated with for various projects. This is a situation where different kinds of analysis have fundamentally different goals. There's absolutely room for objective, mathy analysis that talks precisely about what notes and sets really are there in the music. That's what stuff like Neo-Riemannian theory is all about. But there's also a need for analysis of how music expresses ideas to an audience, and for that kind of thing the idea of modal borrowing really is important. People have a natural tendency to explain unfamiliar, unexpected things in terms of stuff they are familiar with. So if someone is listening to a piece in C major that uses a surprising A flat, they'll want to explain the A flat in terms of something they already understand. And the tradition of 2 tonalities, major and minor, was historically the go-to explanation for this. A flat doesn't fit into C major, but it does fit into a very similar C minor, so it's natural to immediately associate A flat with the minor key. Certainly many composers of the tonal era expected this from their listeners. They built it into their music for expressive effect. I would love to know what you all think about borrowed chords in the comments and on Discord. Please check out my website and like, comment, and subscribe.